Okay, so welcome and good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to have you here for this HR Heroes session on elevating women in leadership. You may know that this is day 2 of a 3-day event for us, and this may be your first session with us, or maybe you've joined some of the other sessions that we've been running. Whatever the case, we're of course very pleased to have you here. But exactly in the spirit of the other sessions, this one is geared really towards you, HR Heroes, and it's about giving you a development experience. So this is very much about time for you. It's time for you to relax. Join me in spending some time thinking about your personal growth. But before we get into the session, I'd just like to obviously introduce myself. My name is Colette Andrew Arthur, and I'm an occupational psychologist and principal consultant at LHH. And I look after our Elevating Women in Leadership programme. And that means overseeing and delivering projects for many clients at both the mid and senior level. Okay, so let's look at what we want to achieve in the next 90 minutes. So this session aims to provide you with some development for yourselves, primarily as females in business, as well as giving you at the same time an insight into some of the factors that we know from our own research differentiate those women who are successful at excelling in senior levels. And of course, we do appreciate, we hope we have men joining us on the call today, and you are very welcome. This is not your cue to leave. This session will allow you to actually consider the factors that do affect female advancement in your businesses, and enable you to think about ways in which you might advocate for female talent and hopefully become a champion for accelerating female leaders. So we want to focus on giving you an appreciation of just 3 key areas in developing female talent. Of course, there's many more, but with the time we have today, we're just focusing in on 3 that we hope you will get a lot from. We're going to include some dedicated time for personal reflection as well, so to really make the most of this. And we've got first session really focusing on career and specifically strategic networking. The second area we'll focus on is confidence, and in particular the role that mindset and beliefs play. And then we'll end with looking at personal brand and considering how we can authentically build our brand and represent ourselves. Joining us a little later in the session, we will have a guest speaker, Caris Law, and she's a regional sales director here at LHH. And she'll be here to share her own insights and her own experience as a woman progressing in leadership roles. And she'll be using this as an opportunity to tell her story. And what we have found with our programs is that having a guest speaker, often from the client organisation itself, draws some really powerful parallels for individuals listening. And it can be quite triggering in listening to somebody else and their experience and their points of reflection and insights from their own careers. It can be quite triggering for individuals to start to connect with their own experience. And so we hope, of course, that you have that same sort of moment of insight and reflection as you listen to Caris today. So we'll welcome her a little later. We are a big group, which is great, and we're therefore going to rely on the chat function to hear from you. So great that already you started to introduce yourselves, really appreciate that. And we encourage you to continue to use the chat to join in some of the activities that we've got planned for the session. And as you can see, we're trying to share a worksheet with you each to help you get the most out of the session. The worksheet itself gives a little bit of the content from today, but also some key questions for reflection for you to start to draw your own insights to take away and think about your own personal development. We are working with technology, as we know, and usually this is a very reliable platform, but you've already met Ugne on the chat, so she's in the background helping to manage the technical platform. So should anything go awry for you as you're trying to participate, please do chat to Ugne directly and she will be able to help manage that for you. Okay, so we often get challenged about why focus on only women? And I love this picture and what it represents. I think it nicely speaks to what we're talking about here. It nicely brings us to think about inclusivity and how focusing on female talent really fits with this. So inclusivity is really about providing additional support to create a level playing field for all. And we know from data that women do face headwinds in progressing their careers to more senior levels. And so by focusing on specific areas that are particularly relevant, we can start to help to close that gap and create that level playing field. Our research into the behaviours of women who excel lead us to focus on the challenges, or as we refer to them, the headwinds that might slow female career progression, and actually why so many companies do lose female talent at that mid-level. Our research has helped us to identify, therefore, some development themes to focus on in the advancement of female talent. And as you're looking through these, you may start to acknowledge some of those that resonate with you, and we're going to check in with you in just a moment, but we'll just call out a couple that we particularly see. So, of course, missing the bigger career picture, doubting own potential. We're going to talk to that later when we look at mindset and beliefs. Working with head down, maybe holding on to negative thoughts or negative experiences longer than is helpful to us to maybe learn and move on from that. And so in terms of development themes, it brings us to career activism, it brings us to networking, mindset and beliefs, as I've already mentioned, and some of the others that you can see here on the slide. So we would love to just start by getting your involvement by thinking about which ones actually do resonate with your own experience. Perhaps yourself as a female in your organisation, you can start to identify with one, two, maybe more, or even all of some of these. So Ugne has opened the poll, which is great. So I'd encourage you just to share what's your experience of some of these challenges in progression of females to senior levels in organisations. Underrepresentation, yes, thanks Claire. We will talk to the lack of female role models actually a little bit later also. So Ugne, if you can wrap up that poll in just a moment when everybody's had a chance to respond. And let's see. Great. Yeah, so huge percentage really resonating with doubting own potential. And so we will talk to that, and holding on to negative thoughts also. That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much for sharing. And it's really interesting to see actually. I would love to actually spend a little bit of time maybe delving into why you selected the ones you did. And I'm sure you've got your own stories actually behind each of those. Unfortunately, obviously for today, we can't. What we did do is try and anticipate what we might expect in terms of those that resonated with you. And we do know that women tend to hide their own light, not particularly feeling comfortable with sharing their successes, speaking up about their contributions. But when we look at the behaviours of women who excel, there are a few key ones which we're going to focus on today that we felt you might appreciate hearing more about. So we know that, I'm going to move us on the slide. We know that actually women who excel have a clear shared career plan, and that means thinking longer term about their aspirations rather than focusing short term on the next job or opportunity. We know that successful women have strong networks that they use strategically to progress their careers, and they exhibit a high degree of confidence and resilience. So they have a positive mindset and are able to share those successes confidently, so able to be their own self-advocate. So we're going to start by focusing on career development in female leaders as the first topic for today. I'm going to start again with just getting you involved. So I'd like you to type into the chat some of the things that perhaps you dreamed you would be as you grew up. So I don't know, maybe it was an astronaut, zookeeper, I love to tell the story actually here, which is when I asked my colleague this same question, her response was that she actually wanted to be a belly dancer, and much to her dismay was misheard and packed off to ballet dancing lessons. So that didn't exactly didn't go where she thought it might. Yeah, firefighter, ballet dancer, politician, fantastic lawyer, geologist, wonderful. Keep them coming. Nurse, and then I realised I didn't like the sight of blood. Yes, that's a little bit limiting, isn't it? There's quite a lot of that to deal with. Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so it would be great and lovely, wouldn't it, if our careers looked like this journey here. We start at A and we have a plan and we progress in a nice linear fashion over time, arriving exactly at our destination B when we thought we would. But in reality, we know that there are lots of permutations, lots of combinations, stop-off points, and we rarely end up in a job or career that we had perhaps envisaged. And these days, careers are rarely linear. We may have more than one career in our lifespan. And there are a range of options at how we arrive at our destination. And perhaps we don't actually know what our destination is going to be. You know, that's not always clear for us, and we're still working that out. And one of the factors for women who were successful was actually having a clear shared career plan. And we know from our research is that women tend to think short term about their careers. They tend to focus on the next job or opportunity rather than what each step is building towards. And actually that can lead women to feel stuck because perhaps they don't have a plan for where they're moving to next. We know that women rate their abilities accurately or indeed underestimate their abilities, whilst men are more likely to be overconfident about theirs. And this leads women taking less risks to go after opportunities if they're not 100% matched with the job role requirements. Whereas by comparison, we know that men are prepared to go for those opportunities if perhaps they only meet maybe 60% of the role requirements. And so for women, it really means that we are considering less opportunities than men consider. And we perhaps are more restrictive or dismissive about those in which we consider ourselves relevant. Whereas men, on the other hand, perhaps go for more and are increasing their chances of landing that next promotion or career move. So it starts an interesting point of reflection for us in terms of how might we be more career active or career proactive. And for those men joining the session today, you might be thinking about how actually you can have career coaching conversations with females in your team to get them to think longer term about their careers and the steps to get there. And what might you do to encourage that thinking? I suppose it leads us to start to think about how many times we perhaps think that if we're doing a good job and we're working really hard, that actually that will get noticed and that will lead to people sort of considering us for new opportunities. And in the same vein, you know, it might therefore, we may have found ourselves certainly in situations where we're wondering perhaps why we weren't considered for a promotion or why that opportunity wasn't mentioned to us. And so it leads us to think about, well, what are those factors that lead us to see that some people's careers do accelerate faster than our own? What are some of the factors that, as David Thompson in his career helium model refers to as, some careers do float above or rise above others, and what are some of the things that are behind that? And so we talk about career activism. It's really about sort of acknowledging that working hard, doing a good job, hopefully means, of course, we'll get a sense of achievement. Certainly, we would like to think it would lead to some sort of recognition and perhaps even reward, but not necessarily advancement. And I mentioned earlier that we have Caris Law joining us to speak later. And one of the things that she will talk to is a career opportunity that arose for her, and actually the sort of thinking that went around that, and how she had to really challenge herself in the way that she was thinking about this opportunity. So we'll hear a little bit more about that as an example, and that might again call into some contrast, some of your own experiences. In particular, when we look at career activism, we consider all of these factors around this model. But for the purpose of today, we're going to focus on networking. And our research has found that women who are successful do tend to have stronger networks than those who are less successful at making it to more senior levels. So as I review this slide, I'd like each of you to think about where perhaps this resonates for you, which of these might best describe how your network is or is not working for you. So we know from our research that women tend to be under-mentored or under-sponsored. We know that women tend to have better organisational networks down the organisation and men upwards. So we tend to lack senior connections. And we know that women have good personal connections for support and operational networks or connections for getting the job done successfully. But of course, that doesn't necessarily help us as we seek to move to more senior levels. We know from our research that we prefer to network with our own gender. And again, that's fine, no problem, until of course we start to try and make it to more senior levels where there are limited senior females through which we can network. And so it starts to become more limiting. And then finally, the difference in networks and usage is that we know that women tend to avoid making career asks of their networks. So tending to be givers of our networks rather than takers. So the overall message here around networking is that actually women tend to have smaller networks and closer relationships, which they tend to primarily use for that psychosocial support and not necessarily for strategic career advancement. And that can obviously have an impact. So we're going to focus on strategic networking as an area of focus for us to think about for the next short while. We want you to think about, as you look at this model here of looking at our sphere of influence, considering your own network. So perhaps, do you have those personal and operational networks, people within your function, but maybe not people that extend outside of your function to senior leaders, other departments, maybe even outside of your organisation to other organisations through conferences and associations, for example. So as we look at your network, we obviously want to help you identify where are the gaps, where are the strengths, how might you improve that? And so some of the questions you might start to ask yourself about your strategic network are, do you have people in your network who could help you understand the political landscape? People who can connect you into the pulse of the organisation. What's the current mood music? How do you get things done? How to tap into senior connections and understanding what's hot and what's not, what's really going on underneath the skin. Secondly, you might want to start asking yourself, who would speak highly of me to others higher up the organisation? So who appreciates and understands the value that you bring and add and can reference you and mention you in the right places? So spot opportunities for you, showcase your value and really speak of you in those circles that will help for advancement. Also brings us to think about who can increase your visibility at higher levels, who can maybe invite you into meetings, make connections, increase your profile. And do you have those connections in your network, or perhaps this is a gap for you to think about. And then finally, we sort of link it back to understanding that shared career plan and who does have an appreciation of your career aspirations, because having others in your network who do know some of those aspirations would be therefore in a better position to perhaps spot opportunities for you, think of you for those opportunities and make reference of them and you in those right circles. Okay, so there's a couple of themes as we've sort of gone through this model to think about. First is to question whether your network is sufficiently broad. does it connect to different kinds of people across different departments, different levels, inside and outside of your organisation? Research tells us that actually when we're left to our own devices around networking, we tend to form convenience networks, people who are, I suppose, just like me, and people who we share an interest with, who we naturally get on well with. But these convenient networks lack breadth and diversity in terms of ideas and inputs. They tend to be similar in the information that we're likely to share and hold. And so, of course, close relationships, as we've described already, are obviously important. They create some high trust connections that help us to feel supported and to get the job done now. But we need to start to appreciate also the value of more distant, weaker ties that can start to form a bridge, and I'm going to use this term, connect, into other circles, other networks that perhaps we're not part of. So to enable us to gain that diverse perspective and keep our network strategic. And then the final one is dynamic. So questioning whether our network is actually evolving and changing with us. We tend to build our network and rely on the same few people for our career asks, or indeed to get the job done. And actually, we might need to be thinking about our network growing and expanding, or ongoing, as something that's quite active for us to manage. I can certainly share a story of my own, which is, I didn't do this a few years ago. And when I came back from my maternity leave, our organisation had gone through a very significant reorg and reshuffle, and it meant that my strategic network had all but changed and disappeared overnight. And it really reminded me of the importance of actually paying attention to this, because I had to start my network from scratch and establish new relationships that were relevant to the new role I came back into. And so our networks are rarely as good as their importance. When we're busy on a daily basis, of course, it's the thing that falls by the wayside, because it is a longer term project. It's something that we have to focus on as an opportunity on the horizon. But I want to sort of, I suppose, call this into action for yourself now whilst we're together, to bring it back to the forefront of your mind, and really think about how we might be starting to do this more regularly and make it something that is part of our daily mindset. So with that in mind, hybrid has obviously created a convenient opportunity for us to connect with people remotely. It allows us to set up virtual coffees and grab that chat in a much more easy fashion than perhaps a couple of years ago when we were looking to get face-to-face with people. So I just wondered if you had tips that you would share for each other around how you do currently find yourself networking successfully. What are some of the tips that are working for you to really build your network with others and keep those network contacts alive? So if you could, lovely, yeah. So when you see someone present at Spice, you reach out, connect with virtual coffee. Super. Thanks, Maria. Be intentional about it. Lovely, Nikki, thank you. Yeah, very much so. Use your calendar. Yes. Yeah, there's something about the regularity and making this a practice. Yeah, be visible on socials, interact regularly. Brave. Yes, there's something about being courageous. Yeah, we can often think of networking as something big, scary and hairy, but actually, it really is about just building relationships. And, we have skills in doing that I think we overlook when we think about networking. Yeah, ask your manager who they would suggest you connect with. Yeah, stay in contact with ex-colleagues. Lovely. Fantastic. All right. So there's some lovely ones there. In your worksheet, we've included just a couple, but I think some of the ones that you've included there are also really, really relevant. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is obviously to map your current network, identify the gaps, email, phone are still obviously the best way to contact people, and the hybrid environment really allows us to do that very easily. So make use of the current environment, make use of the fact that we are in this current circumstance, which allows it to be very convenient. Do your homework. We talked about actually be intentional, and I love that. Do your homework to think about ways that you can add value to your network. And I think we've covered through sort of connect through others. So connect through your manager's network. Absolutely. Who would they recommend you can access, and use your contacts to connect through into other circles. Super. Lovely. All right. Don't chase those who aren't up for it. Look again. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Cara. Okay. So I'd like to give you some deliberate thinking time now, just to really consolidate some of the insights perhaps that have started to surface for you as we've talked about careers and in particular strategic networking. So I'd like you just to think about maybe the gaps you have in your network, what actions you'd like to take to close some of those gaps, maybe thinking about some of the points we discussed around career and whether you do think long or short term about your career. And just make a couple of notes to yourself, just so that you've got some takeaways from this particular section. For female champions joining, so any males on the phone, love you to think about how you can create opportunities for females to network through your own network. Are you sharing influential contacts? Perhaps you protect some of those more influential relationships without knowing it. And how can you make introductions? Are you finding ways to create opportunities for the talent in your team to network? And are you speaking highly of your female talent? I'm just going to give you a couple of moments pause to do that. Okay, all right, hopefully that gave you just a short amount of time just to collect some of those thoughts, jot down some insights, give yourself some reminders you might want to follow up in today's session. Okay, fab. All right, so I'd like to move on to the second area for today, and that's really focusing on confidence, and in particular mindset and beliefs. And the strapline that's very much going to see us through this section is what you tell yourself matters. And I saw a great quote today, actually. It was very timely as I was preparing for this. And it was that your mind will always believe everything you tell it. And so I just think that's a fabulous reminder that what we tell it, therefore, ought to be positive and helpful and constructive and not negative. And actually, our Elevating Women in Leadership research found that women who were successful at reaching senior leadership levels differed markedly in their mindset and beliefs. So they held the belief that there were no barriers for themselves. And that was despite the fact that there may well have been many factors around them that could have prevented them from being successful. But actually, they didn't let that get in the way of their own beliefs around what they could personally accomplish. And so we really sort of acknowledge that this mindset and beliefs plays a critical part. We know that women are more likely to doubt their own potential and hold on to negative thoughts. such as imposter syndrome, that feeling that we're going to be found out very shortly. And it's not that men don't have negative thoughts, of course. We recognise that everybody can feel negative and have bad experiences that they worry about. But what we know from our research is that women do tend to hold on to those negative thoughts for longer. So we do not let go of our negative thoughts as quickly. And if we've had a bad experience, we can tend to ruminate and spend longer reliving that experience than actually taking the learning from it and moving on and letting go. We also know that women generally feel awkward about talking about their accomplishments. And as we've already said, expect results to speak for themselves. And we've already sort of talked about the idea that if we work really hard and do a good job, it will get noticed. And what's really relevant is that women are actually just as ambitious as men at the start of their careers, but that this does falter if companies fail to encourage them. And we know that women at various life stages, for various reasons, perhaps do power down to balance competing demands. So not just childcare, but maybe looking after elderly parents and lots of other factors, but maybe do forget to power back up and need that encouragement for them to shift that mindset. And so we know that actually, what we think and what we believe has a direct impact on the behaviours. And so it's worth us thinking about whether we are holding on to beliefs and mindsets that make it harder or easier for us to live up to our full potential and what we want to accomplish for ourselves. We walk into situations every day where we tell ourselves things that perhaps aren't helpful. This meeting is going to be a waste of my time. I don't belong here. I'm out of my depth. I'm not good enough. It wouldn't have been very helpful for me today if I'd repeatedly told myself that I was a terrible presenter. That would have really not done me very, very much good at all. So we have to really catch these thoughts and really make sure that we are acknowledging that they have a huge impact on our confidence, that they have an impact on our presence and actually the perception in the eyes of others. And so we need to be sure that we are making sure that we understand ourselves and the way we talk to ourselves and the narrative that we bring and those deeply rooted beliefs so we can start to challenge them. And one of the things that I've had to do is work hard on myself in this regard also. And I've certainly been brought up with the value of hard work. Nothing's worth doing unless it's worth doing well. And that leads me to have what I believe is a helpfully strong work ethic. But also, of course, it doesn't always work in my favour. It leads me to strive for perfection where perhaps it's not needed. And I can spend time ruminating on striving for that perfection, which comes at a price or at a cost of other things. And of course, each time I'm spending longer on something and saying yes to trying to create perfection, of course, unintentionally, I will be saying no to other things that could have demanded my attention. And so we have to sort of start to reflect on the impact that these unhelpful mindsets and beliefs are having on us. And so there are some common ones that you, I'm sure, will have perhaps acknowledged in yourselves or those around you at various times. And perhaps like me, you might be able to tick 1, 2, maybe all of these. Of course, there's the imposter syndrome that we've already referred to, thoughts of putting yourself down, not being good enough, perfectionism we've mentioned, excessive worrying about if it all goes wrong, not tolerating uncertainty, maybe being afraid of showing weakness and not wanting to ask for help. So these are just some of those unhelpful thoughts and beliefs that we might hold. And again, I'm just going to ask Ugne to open a poll to just get a sense as to which, if not some, all resonate with yourselves in this area. Ugne, are you able to open the poll on this?
Sorry, it seems to have, it's not letting me open it.
Okay, that's fine, no problem. I wonder if people could just share. Oh, there we go. It's there now.
Oh, there we go.
Fantastic.
It took a while.
I was going to use the chat, but that's great. Also, yeah. Thanks, Cara. Yes, we'll talk about that later. I've got a lovely example around a female I had on a programme who very much felt that that was the case, that there was an opportunity that was already likely decided. And as it turned out, that wasn't necessarily the case. Okay, so in terms of the poll, it's looking like there's a good spread across the majority of those. Everybody's starting to respond. We'll end that poll now. No, that would be great. Let's have a look at where we got to. Great, yeah. So perfectionism being, lots of you out there very much like me with that potential derailer, I suppose, and then a good spread across the others, like excessive worry, putting yourself down, imposter syndrome. It's really hard, isn't it, to catch ourselves, to actually consider some of the ways we're talking to ourselves. And we do need to be able to actually be able to move on from those negative thoughts in order to be able to reframe them. And that's very much what we're going to move on to talk about now. So first part is obviously recognizing those limiting beliefs. And then it's about how do we overcome them and find a new perspective. And so we have to think about, for example, imposter syndrome. And there's somebody I've been coaching at the moment who is really struggling with this. They really feel that their successes are somehow down to a fluke. And what we're working on is trying to get this individual to own their successes and their past accomplishments, and actually to acknowledge that they have played a significant role in, actually their skills and their strengths, speak for themselves, and it's getting them to actually acknowledge that. Of course, there's the excessive worry. What if it all goes wrong? Perhaps reframing this, if it all goes wrong, I can deal with it. Certainly for me, I find it very helpful to think of the worst case scenario and build back from there. Think about the probability of that worst case scenario happening. But also perhaps even if it feels probable, really preparing for handling that, so that actually if I've got a plan in place for the very worst case scenario, that anything in between actually can start to feel more manageable. And then putting self down. And so it brings me on to the example, Cara, that I was just referring to. So we did have a female on one of my programs, and she didn't want to apply for a promotion. It was a hotly contested opportunity, and there were some 50 others applying, and she didn't see the point. She felt that actually, how would she, compete, and she wouldn't likely get it. So what was the point anyway? What was the point in trying? But actually, through the programme, she started to recognise that nothing ventured, nothing gained, and she felt encouraged to try to go for it, putting it down to an experience in and of itself, to get to go through an interview that she hadn't been for in a while. And actually, she did get the job. So, sometimes what we tell ourselves isn't always close to the reality, despite the fact that she had felt that it was already decided. And then perfectionism. And I like to rethink this as striving for excellence rather than perfectionism. So maybe letting go a little bit of the 100%, and actually sometimes something close to 85 will be perfectly acceptable. Okay. So some more strategies then as we start to think about mindset. And the one that I love here is really adding yet to anything that you're maybe talking to yourself negatively around. So I can't do it yet. I don't have the experience yet. I don't know how. I'm not ready. I don't have the experience yet. I almost want to, perhaps I should have put this in capitals. I want you to shout it to yourself and yell it, because it's a really powerful way of actually reframing and coaching yourself to, well, what do I need to do if I don't feel ready yet? Then how can I coach myself to identify what would help me feel better ready? What would be the things and the steps that I can do to help me get there? And so again, for any males joining us, it's considering how you can help females to overcome these negative self-perceptions, challenge their beliefs, help them reframe, and really help to, own their successes, help them to, really own their achievements and speak to those. So I've popped this slide in here because it's the one that really actually forces me to pause and reflect a little bit more deeply. And that's to say, talk to yourself like you would somebody that you love. I think this is just simply a great reminder. We often talk to ourselves in ways that we wouldn't dream of talking to perhaps a friend or a colleague if they were to come to us with a problem or a concern. We would be much more prepared to be compassionate. So I just encourage you to engage in a little bit of self-compassion, be kind, speak positively to yourself, be encouraging, find ways to be supportive and build yourself up and not down, and start noticing, observe those thoughts. And if you're not feeling positive, try and identify why perhaps that is. What's the narrative that you're telling yourself? What's the evidence that you have for that? And how can you reframe that into something more positive and helpful? I don't know whether any of you do this already, but certainly I find trying to engage in a positive daily affirmation is very helpful. To affirm something early in the morning and keep that as my mantra for the day is something that I find keeps me grounded, keeps me in that positive space. And actually, as those negative thoughts start to creep in, it's the thing that I use to kind of pull myself back. And you can get apps to do this. You can get cards that you can pop on your desk. And for those of you that maybe find it difficult to identify what that negative self-talk is that you're maybe engaging in, then journaling is a great way to start to notice. So starting to engage in a daily journal, writing entries can help us to be a little bit more present and to catch some of those negative self-talk and try to start to identify the triggers for those and start to reframe as we have described. So again, I'm going to pause for a deliberate moment of reflection. And I'd like you to think about perhaps an unhelpful thought that is recurring for you. Maybe it's a regular recurring thought. Maybe it's something that has happened today that has made you think negatively. Or maybe it's something this week. Maybe just for the purposes of this, identify an unhelpful thought and think about how you can move into a more positive space. What could you do to reframe that? And for female champions joining, I encourage you to think about how could you help a female colleague let go of perhaps a negative experience more quickly, helping to take the learning from it and find ways in which they can let go. I'm just going to give you a couple of moments. Okay. All right. So, in just a moment, we're going to have Caris join us, as I've mentioned, and it will be a nice continuation of this theme. She will be able to share a little bit about some of her own unhelpful thoughts and how she has reframed them. Before then, I am going to give us just a chance for a bit of a stretch break, a comfort break. Fantastic. All right. Well, I hope you managed to maybe just stretch your legs. You were very busy on the chat, which was fabulous, and some really super positive intents that I am absolutely delighted to see. Some real courageous statements of being brave, make the first move, adding the word yet. That seems to have really caught a lot of your attention. And I agree. I find it incredibly powerful to add that to some of my negative thoughts, to just really reframe it, that actually it's within our capability to move beyond some of those limiting thoughts and find a way through. I love the take a deep breath and go for it. It's something that you may have turned down if you didn't feel that you were good enough, but go for it anyway and see what happens. Super. So I really encourage you, if you haven't done so, write your own positive intent down so that you take it away from this session. Any others that you have seen in the chat that really start to inspire you, also grab those and write those down as well. We want you to really take this as an opportunity to hold something in your own mind's eye that you will do differently. Okay, so we're going to move into the next session, and it's with great delight that I introduce us into our guest speaker slot with Caris. Caris is going to tell us about her own career progression and various points of reflection, as I've mentioned. I think I mentioned earlier at the start that there's one particular point that I know Caris will bring forward into her overview, which is about a particular opportunity for a promotion that raised some questions in her own mind. And it's really interesting to hear how Caris sort of worked through that and the result of that. What I'd like you to do is, there is space in your worksheet for those of you that did manage to download it. Obviously write down anything that triggers for you, anything that's helpful, that resonates, that starts to pull forward some of your own insights. And anything that's particularly interesting or resonating and you want to share it with the group as Caris is talking, then again, please use the chat to communicate that with us. It's great to see what's resonating and how people are connecting with what Caris is sharing. So without any further ado, Caris, if I could get you to take yourself off mute. Welcome, welcome. Lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Colette. Yeah, it's great. It's great to be here. I hope I'm sure you're having a really amazing session. So yeah, looking forward to sharing a few thoughts and hopefully answering some questions as well if people have any. So I guess I'll just kick off. I think it's the worst thing in the world having to talk about yourself, isn't it? I think, I'm very happy to talk about lots of other things, but talking about yourself is quite often the most challenging. I'll start, I guess, with a bit of a snapshot of my career to date. And there have probably been two periods in my career where some of the themes that you've been talking about today really, really resonate. And, to be fair, I haven't taken necessarily my own advice in terms of some of the things that I've done at those times. But so my background is, I describe myself as having three careers almost, really. Very squiggly. I don't know if you're familiar with the TED Talks around sort of careers, but there have been some key moments that have influenced some of the choices that I made. My first career, as I mentioned many moons ago, was in HR, and I spent close to 10 years in operational HR working in power stations, which was very male dominated, very industrial. There were probably 30 women on a site of 600 men, and it was in the 90s. So perhaps, some of the tales I could tell you from being a woman working in that environment for another day, but it was certainly an interesting time and quite different, thankfully, to where we are today, I think. Having worked and I was based up in North Wales at the time, I decided that I wanted to move down to London. And at that point, I actually registered with a number of recruitment agencies to look for work. And I think I registered with 5 agencies, and I actually got 3 of them started to talk to me about joining them as a recruitment consultant. So by now it was, it was the year 2000, and I thought, well, I'll do it for a little while and I'll find myself a great HR job and we'll all be happy. And so I joined one of the bigger recruitment companies, recruiting HR professionals. And of course, 10 years later, I was still really loving recruitment, and it lit a fire in me, really, helping people, working with lots of different clients, the diversity of it, but also the sort of performance culture and, sales culture, and actually initially quite an aggressive sales culture. And I think you're going to talk a little bit later about personal brand and authenticity. And when I reflect back on that time now, early on, I actually, even if I look back at photos, even down to the clothes I was wearing, I adopted actually in that what was quite an aggressive sales environment, a lot of male traits. I would wear a pinstripe suit and a fitted shirt, and when I actually reflect on that now, and I took during that period, sort of, I moved into leadership roles. I had a fairly standard kind of progression. I started as an individual contributor, then I became a team leader, and then a regional director, and then I got a bit of a bigger region. And ultimately, in the time that I was there, I ended up being operations director, which was, quite a big job. And I had sort of 60 people reporting through to me in one way or another. And I think sort of partway through my leadership journey there, I took some feedback from one of the elder statesmen in the organisation, and it was a flippant comment, actually. And he made a comment about me being scary, and that I was a scary person. He wouldn't want to cross me. And that actually really struck home to me. And I think it started me on a journey about really what type of leader I wanted to be. Because actually I didn't want to be scary. I'm not scary. And, my family wouldn't say that I was scary. And certainly, my children wouldn't, I wish they were. But equally, I was obviously giving off that persona. So at that point, I don't think I ever lost my sense of integrity, but I don't think I was totally, authentic in my leadership style. So I think Colette's going to cover that off with you. But I think that's something really important that we need to think about when we're in leadership, is that it doesn't mean that you have to be a different person. It doesn't have to be, I'm making sweeping statements generally, but, you don't have to be more male in your approach. Everyone can have their own leadership style. So moving swiftly on to the big change for me, which was, as I say, I was in an operations director role. I decided I wanted to start a family. I was pregnant. I spoke to my manager. I said, things aren't going to change. I'm going to take 3 or 4 months off. I'm going to get a nanny. And then I'll be back. Everything will be as it was. And, I'll see you then. And I'm almost ashamed to say now that I worked up until, she was early actually, and I worked almost up until the day she was born, even to the point where I was on my BlackBerry when I was in the hospital. I mean, it shows you how long, it's 10 years ago, so, BlackBerries. But, and of course, everything did change for me. In an instant, I realised that within 2 weeks, I knew I wasn't going to go back to that job, let alone go back in 3 months. It really rocked my world, I suppose. And it is life-changing, right? It's the most natural thing in the world, but it's definitely a life-changing experience. So I ended up taking a year off, going back, taking a big career step back, going back 4 days a week, and going back into an individual contributor role, which at that point had no leadership responsibility at all. And in some ways that was great, and in some ways it was the right thing to do, because I felt good about it. But I also think, and this is about reflection and hindsight, I probably could have found a better balance, because I do think that in that time that I took off, my confidence really, in my own mindset, in my own beliefs, I genuinely didn't think that it was possible for me to be in a leadership role like that and be a good mother and have flexibility. And I think Part of it, I think, relates to the time. I mean, it was 10 years ago, which doesn't seem like a long time ago, but I really do feel, particularly post-pandemic, it feels a really long time ago in terms of how we reflect and think about these things. But partly that was coming from me. So I did actually take, you know, a pretty big backward step at the time. Now, over time, I started to rebuild my confidence, and actually sort of 3 years into a new role in a new sector. I'd moved out of recruitment by this point, and I was now working in talent solutions and sales within talent solutions. I got asked if I would take on a leadership role. And once again, I sort of, you know, toyed, can I do this? Is this something that I can do and still balance? And I did. And actually, I continued for some years doing that role on a 4-day-a-week basis. But I do think, even in those very early days when I went back into a leadership role, I don't know why I thought I couldn't do it, but I genuinely thought I couldn't do it. It was almost as if all of that experience that I'd had in all of those years prior to having Ellen, which, to be fair, I'd never actually experienced imposter syndrome, if I'm honest. It only really came to me in that moment when I had a family and I was trying to balance everything. It was almost as if I thought I'd forgotten, you know, but my brain muscle did eventually kick in, and my commercial experience kicked in, and my, you know, the way I like to manage and the way I like to work with my team, that did kick in. But I almost had to experience it to believe that it was possible, which I think, you know, in hindsight, is probably a bit of a shame. But I think it's an important point to make, that when you go through a process like that, it's actually your confidence that you lose. You don't necessarily lose any of your capability. You know, your capability is still there. You're still the same person. I think just, and I'm conscious of Colette's time today, and we are short on time today, but I think just to repeat that I almost made the same mistake again, because actually then some years later, I was offered a role in a startup. A former colleague and manager of mine was going to join a new startup organisation, and he wanted me to go in and set up a sales function. And again, we were in talent solutions, and it was incredibly exciting. It was a fantastic organisation. The product we had was brilliant. In theory, and you know, and I spent a year there building that business, and it was brilliant. I loved it. Unfortunately, it did come to a very abrupt, as startups sometimes do. There was a disagreement at the top, and unfortunately, the person who'd hired me moved on, which unfortunately meant that everyone that he'd hired, and there were 5 or 6 of us, were also moved on, shall we say. And it all happened very, very quickly. I'd never experienced anything like it in my career. It was shocking. It was traumatic. It was crazy. And it was at the start of the pandemic. So, so once again, my brain almost went into lockdown. Everyone else went into lockdown, but my brain went into lockdown again. And I wanted to batten down the hatches, get a job that was really secure. I was actually really lucky in that I had a great network, and I know you've talked about networking, and maybe something, you know, that's something that I can't advocate enough. You know, throughout my career, my networks have been everything to me. But I managed to secure or get an interview and secure a role at LHH, where I felt there was a real sense of purpose because of what I'd been through, and we help a lot of people who have been in similar situations. And I joined LHH about 3 or 4 months into the pandemic, actually. So I joined them in summer of 2020. And then just a tiny little postscript, just to prove that I haven't necessarily learned my lesson, and that every day we still have to self-check and remind ourselves that, you know, we can do this stuff and that we are good enough. In April of this year, as part of a restructure, there was a leadership role advertised internally, and my wonderful manager, who's now my colleague, said to me, well, are you going to apply for this job? And I said, oh gosh, I've only been here for 5 minutes. I couldn't possibly apply for this job. This is ridiculous. And he said, of course you're going to apply for this job. You're really experienced. You've got the right experience. You've got loads of experience. You should apply for it. And anyway, I did apply for it. And I went through the process and I secured the role. And in truth, I've never looked back. I have an amazing team, a new team that I've met. I have an amazing group of colleagues. But again, it actually took Clinton to tell me to apply. So I think it's a lesson. You know, I've been in really senior leadership roles, and I've had various levels of my career where I've gone up and I've gone down and I've gone all around. But the self-checking on that mindset piece, whether you're good enough for something, whether you have 100% of what's required for the role, or whether actually the yet, which Colette mentioned, I think it's super important that we just continue to remind ourselves of these points, because I hope and pray that if anything like this happens again, or if I'm ever in a situation where I need to go and push myself forward again, I think I've learned now, I will absolutely do it. And then ultimately, what's the worst that can happen? So I don't know if that covers off what you wanted me to cover, but
Oh, that was wonderful, Caris. Thank you. Yeah, superb. Does anybody have any questions for Caris whilst we've still got her here? I did see one come up about how did you not question yourself or abilities when undergoing negative experience, and that was referring to the redundancy that happened. Obviously.
Yeah. I mean, oh, look, I absolutely did. Is the honest answer to that. But I think it was different in that there was a group of us that were in the same situation. But yeah, I went through my mind and I racked my brains, what I could have done differently, what I could have done that might have meant that, I wasn't, that it hadn't happened. But I think ultimately, and again, this is where your network comes in. This is where your network helps you. It was kind of out in the public domain that this happened, and lots of people did call me and talk to me, and I spoke to former colleagues and I spoke to friends about it. And I think you just have to be really open with people. And then, of course, when I started working at LHH, then you start thinking, well, actually, you know what? It wasn't them, or it wasn't me, it was them. And that's, and you start to believe in yourself, I think. But yeah, talking to people, talking to former colleagues, building that network is really, is really, really super important, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Caris. And I think certainly what you've demonstrated is that openness and actually being prepared to be vulnerable. And we talked a little bit about some of the mindsets and belief where actually not wanting to show that we need help, and actually you were able in that scenario to use your network to kind of say, actually, I find myself here, what can you do to help me? And that has helped you to kind of move on. So fantastic. Caris, wonderful. Thank you for joining us for today. I think I've seen some lovely comments around how powerful that has been. If there is any anything else that's triggered for yourselves, please do share that in the chat. It's always great for us to get feedback, and obviously it helps us in running sessions like this in terms of what works and what really resonates. But that was fantastic. Thanks, Caris. Okay,
wonderful. Enjoy the rest of the session.
Thanks, Caris. Will do. All right. So I'm going to go back to sharing slides. One of the things that actually listening to Caris that I couldn't help but really call upon was actually what she mentioned right at the end, which was that sometimes we do find ourselves in situations where there is a role that comes up and we are interested, perhaps, maybe it's a promotion, maybe it's just a different direction for us. And that we don't immediately want to go for it, that actually we start to say to ourselves, I'm not ready, I can't go for that, it's too early. And we have these connotations of, I don't have enough experience, or it's too soon. I need to be in this role longer. And I suppose I just wanted to call that out, really, because it's one of those things that when we're running our programme, we like to sort of turn it on its head a little bit. And, whilst I suppose as women, we like to be capital I-shaped, broad and deep, both sides, actually sort of turning it on its head to say, well, why not me, and why not now? And when is enough experience enough? And arguably, going back to our career development slide where we talked about actually only considering ourselves when we're 100%, ready for that role. Arguably that's too late. Arguably we should be looking at a different role by that point, to stretch ourselves, and actually, when are we allowing ourselves room to grow? And so I think Caris there gave us a really great example of actually just really being prepared to sort of challenge her own mindset on a number of occasions, actually, and catching herself to move her career on. And as she articulated really well, is that careers aren't linear, and that she's had different careers at different points in her journey thus far, to reflect that life stages do have an impact on us, and we make different choices at different points, and sometimes we power down, sometimes we power up, sometimes there are different decision points for us to make, but really sort of not allowing our confidence to be affected by some of those more negative experiences is obviously a very powerful learning from Caris's story. Okay, so I'd like us to, with that, shift into thinking about personal brand. Caris did allude to that in some of what she shared, and gave that great example of where she had adopted a brand that perhaps was befitting of the environment she found herself in, but actually didn't necessarily authentically represent her, and how she wanted to be known. So we'll kick off this section with just thinking about, our personal brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room, importantly, and let's discover why. And again, if we think about our research and what we know, is that women who are successful really do look after their personal brand and find ways to share their successes in a way that they feel comfortable. And so I couldn't help but, obviously, when we talk about brands, there are some prominent figures whose brands often speak volumes. And so I'd be really keen, as we look at this section, just to, what are the brands that these people say to you? So we've got Serena Williams, we've got the Queen, obviously, Michelle Obama, Meghan Markle, and Greta Thunberg, which is very topical this week. What are these brands represent for you? What do you recognise for each of these individuals? How well does their brand speak? Pop it in the chat if you can identify what these brands are. Perhaps, for example, the Queen, irreplaceable, yeah. So very much, got a strong brand, lifting women up. Michelle Obama, yeah, the Queen, very much for stability. Greta, being your authentic self. Serena, power, responsibility, the Queen, total commitment to her role, position, absolutely, yeah. So as you start to think of them, empowering women, all of them, yeah. So there's really clear brands that we might associate. And you think about Serena Williams, again, I think somebody's mentioned this, but power, champion, success after having children. And we heard from both Caris, and I haven't mentioned my own, but it is a life-changing experience becoming a parent and then balancing that role with your work and your career. Queen, stability, absolutely, total dedication. Greta Thunberg, authenticity, and actually referring to her autism as her superpower and using it to speak frankly, isn't it, to the issues that she cares most about. And I didn't know this until actually quite recently, but there's an aspect to her autism which is referred to as selective mutism, which actually means she only talks when she has something to say. So she's very rarely speaks away from the camera. And so when you know that about her, of course, it again drives a very powerful message that she has this voice on a global stage, despite the fact that actually day by day she's typically mute. Michelle Obama, again, being an extraordinary person, authentic self. I think she refers to herself as really being the same person in her pajamas as she is in the White House. I think that's one of her strap lines. And Meghan Markle, I don't know if we've actually covered her off in the chat. I am keeping my eye on it, but perhaps, apart from that voice for women, there's some confusion maybe over her brand right now. But I'd like to just focus in on authenticity. We've talked about that in relation to Greta and also Michelle. And I'd like us just to sort of think about this for a moment. And many think that actually in the COVID world, that of course we've seen more of the whole person. People who've been at home, people have dressed slightly differently, often more relaxed. And so we've started to learn a little bit more, certainly about our co-workers and our colleagues, and that's helped to sort of maybe break down some barriers. But I guess that the question here around whether we feel that there is any headwind or challenge for women in being authentic at work. And I'd be really keen to open up the poll, Ugne, if you don't mind. Thank you. So I'd be interested to see what we feel about this. Yes, overwhelmingly, I'll share the results with you now. Overwhelmingly, yes, sometimes we think there are headwinds for women in being authentic at work. I'm going to encourage you, for those that have said yes sometimes, just to pop what some of those challenges might be you feel for being authentic at work. I'd be really interested to see what some of the reasons are behind that. It could depend on the industry you work in. Yeah, and as Caris really articulated in her story, a very male-dominated environment led her to represent herself differently as, I guess, a way of coping and a way of actually feeling that she was being heard. And actually, when we talk to females and discuss this area, you're right, there are things that start to come out. And I'm going to share with you some of the things that I end up discussing with women who feel that actually authenticity can feel difficult to represent at senior levels of leadership. And so one of the ones that I often end up discussing is this pressure to fulfill a role or adopt a persona to gain respect. And it's a good opportunity for us to think about what version of us we want to represent at work. What do we want to keep about ourselves in terms of the persona? And what do we want to let go of? And, I've coached somebody just recently who is quite open in saying that actually they've somehow ended up with a very different work persona to their home self. Their home self being quite reflective, a bit of a thinker. But at work, somehow they're much more aggressive, much more on the go, much more chatty, a bit more animated. And actually there's no sort of clarity as to how that's happened, but really wanting to be much more authentic in representing that quieter self at work. And another lady on a programme that I'm running at the moment actually is having a challenge which might surprise some of us on the phone today, which is actually, authentically, she is aggressive and is much more challenging and abrupt. But because she's a female in a leadership role, is often accused of using that as a persona, when actually, she sort of articulates that, she was always like that, even as far back as the playground. She was the bossy, dominant one amongst her peers. So there can be challenges, and to Caris's point, it's about finding that authenticity to represent yourself with integrity. And I've seen in the chat some lovely comments here that sort of being labelled as aggressive, that's praised in men. Yes, and we've got here on the slide that really taps into that. Actually, for some, feeling that the value of compassion and empathy is not recognised, that actually, despite the fact that we've seen even in McKinsey lean in just recently, female leaders who have been able to demonstrate compassion and empathy during lockdown have outperformed their male counterparts in team leadership. Actually, do we still, are these skills really genuinely recognised as important in men, in women as in men? And then this was mentioned earlier, but the lack of female role models. So we've got Jacinta Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister at the moment, who has, of course, led with compassion and empathy. And it's great that we start to get a little bit of recognition for this. But in the round, there are very few female role models at senior levels in business for people to aspire to and understand what authenticity can look like in the broadest of sense. How can we identify that, as Cara says, there are many different types of leadership styles that females can aspire to, and there isn't just one blueprint or one size that must fit all in order to be successful. So I wanted to just pay some attention to what we think might make a personal brand. And of course, there's lots that goes into that. And you may well have others that you would wish to see on this slide. So we've got trust, we've got style, integrity, confidence, expertise, but authenticity, of course, being in there. And so, we've talked about the need to identify a brand. Of course, once we've done that, it's about communicating and being your own self-advocate for that brand. And often women can have negative connotations with sharing successes, self-promotion, self-advocacy, and asking for opportunities. And so you might feel quite comfortable with this as you're sort of thinking about yourself. Or perhaps you're a bit more like Lady B here, where she feels a bit cringe and quite awkward about the idea of advocating for self, promoting self, sharing successes, maybe asking for opportunities. So again, in the chat, if you're a bit more like this lady here, B, I feel a bit awkward about self-advocacy, then type B in the chat. If you're much more like female A here, then type A, just get a sense of where people are. Thanks, Joe. Transparency, another one. Yeah, I guess that comes to trust, doesn't it, as well? But yes, absolutely. B, yeah. Perhaps no surprises, but yeah, it starts to feel a bit uncomfortable for us when we think about advocating for ourselves. That's quite a powerful word in and of itself, isn't it? And yet we know that the behaviours of women who excel do this very successfully. And of course, we know that it's really important. If we think back to the slide of the famous people we've just reviewed, of course, they've spent time establishing their own brand, in some cases quite deliberately, to ensure that it does support what they want to be known for. So again, we're going to talk about reframing. It's a word that we've used a couple of times already today, but it's about moving from feeling as though it's bragging and being on some level arrogant to actually recognizing the value for career progression in terms of making your work visible and acknowledging the value that you're contributing. And as I talk to this, I sort of want to, I suppose, call out that what we're not saying is that this is all about, crassly blowing our own trumpet, but it is about being really honest with ourselves around whether we miss opportunities to promote ourselves. And there might be opportunities on a daily basis through which we can gently and more subtly position ourselves. For example, I know certainly when I get given feedback and it's positive, it's very humbling to just kind of say, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. And move on very quickly. And not staying with that to actually position, that feedback's been delivered because perhaps, I've had to work really hard in a difficult scenario or the effort that it required, and actually positioning that on the back of the feedback to say, for example, I really appreciate that feedback. That means a lot because actually this was a difficult scenario and I'm really pleased that that's actually been acknowledged, and I'd be really pleased to share the learning and actually stay with that moment a little bit longer to actually make visible what's gone into achieving that feedback, and allowing that value to be explored a little bit more. So I suppose I'm trying to say that actually it's finding ways that's comfortable for us to actually start to think about how we self-advocate, and we'll all have our own ways, our own language around this, and how we might do it. We've included in your worksheet an example, and think about, how we might start to actually represent ourselves. And of course, that leads us back to thinking about, as Karis said, our network is so important to representing us also. And we need to be clear on our own brand and what we want to be known for in order that our network can advocate for us also. And that's, there's nothing more powerful than having a network that can speak up around our successes and what we want to be known for, and what we contribute and the value we bring, and spot those opportunities for us, again, particularly in the right circles, in relation to careers, as an example. So it is about tying those loops together in terms of feeling able to articulate it for ourselves, and then finding ways that we can help our network to do that as well for us. Okay, so we are coming to the close of the session. I appreciate that we have skimmed along the top of a number of different areas today, but we did want to give you a chance to see a couple of different aspects of developing female talent. So I do want to just give you a moment to reflect on this notion of personal brand. What do you want to be known for? What are the opportunities that maybe you're missing currently to share your successes, and how might you do that more comfortably? What's some of the language that you could start to do to put around that? And for males joining, I'd like you to think about how you can increase the visibility of females you work with. What are the opportunities that you have to share successes and advocate for their brand? Are you mentioning them in the right circles? Are you giving kudos to their contributions? One of the things we didn't talk about but comes out in the research is that quite often, if women are in the minority in a meeting, we will often speak less, and our ideas don't always get attributed to us. And so again, the question for males joining is, are you helping to ensure that ideas are being attributed to females that are in the meetings? Okay, so I'll just give you a couple of moments to capture your final thoughts on this last topic. Seen a couple of questions around appraisees. How often should we do appraisees? Well, for us, we very much, I'm running a session tomorrow. I don't know if anybody's signed up for that, but we're talking about performance management in a hybrid context. And for us, it's very much an ongoing process of feedback. And using regular catch-ups for feedback and positive recognition. But of course, yes, more formal catch-ups around the cycle we would agree with quarterly. Okay, so I'm going to bring us back, and we've covered these 4 areas here around having a shared career plan, networking, and confidence, mindset and beliefs we talked about in that regard, and obviously self-advocating and building our brand and advocating that. And I'd like us to think about going back to that positive intent and thinking as you leave the session, how you can perhaps think about how you might move from a HR hero who maybe hides your own light to a HR hero who is prepared to own your own successes and speak to those confidently, and maybe advocate for yourself and other females. And for males joining, hopefully you're moving from a HR hero who maybe didn't appreciate some of the challenges women face in progressing to more senior levels, and maybe now you're leaving with an appreciation of those and wanting to be a HR hero who is prepared to champion female talent and advocate on their behalf. So that would be great to give yourself a positive intent that you can leave the session with today. So I encourage you to take forward and really work on some of those action points that you've had here. So we're going to pop into the chat an ebook which covers off some of the other areas that came out of our research, and that gives you some support around ways in which you can tackle some of the headwinds that we acknowledge for female advancement. So stick around to download the ebook. And then I'm going to leave you with this final departing thought from Jacinda Ardern, which I think is incredibly apt for the session that we've run today. I appreciate everybody's contribution to the chat. I appreciate it's not quite the same as hearing voices, but it's worked really well, and we've really appreciated having you here.
Just as we close up to the session, my name's Deb Tier, and I'm a Senior Relationship Lead here at LH8. Thank you so much for joining the session. I'm sure that lots of you will go away with questions in your head and lots of reflection points. If at any point you do want to follow up or you have questions, I know that there's been some questions in the chat already about if the messages in the chat are also shared on the recording. They're not. So if you do have a want for wanting to see some of the output from the session, the answers to the polls, or you just have questions, I'm also going to put my email address in the chat now. Do come to me directly and I can help you with Colette therein. And if you could just take a quick 10 seconds to answer this poll so that we can evaluate the session, that would be really useful. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Deb. Sorry, I did intend to invite you to share your email. That's great. Thanks for doing that. I do encourage you, obviously, you're very happy to take questions. And if any of you are joining tomorrow, then I look forward to speaking to you again then. Yeah, Ugne, I don't know how we share the recording, and also there was a question about sharing the slides. Yeah, I'm happy to obviously share the slides as well. So